Hey readers, I'm Leandra.
And I'm Danny, and we are not reading for content.
This is a monthly book club podcast dedicated to reading in depth and leaving no plot point unturned. Each month, we read one book over the course of 3 episodes, basically reading 1/3 of the book at a time. Feel free to listen along, or better yet, read the book with us. Our first season of the book club has the theme of genre blends. A list of books and the club schedule will be in the description.
Hey, readers, welcome back to another episode of Not Reading for Content. We are so excited to have you here to discuss the first 5 chapters of Day of the Triffids. We are very excited to get this ball rolling and see what we think of this classic sci-fi horror. But before we get to the good stuff, we do need to talk about our bookish fight. And so, what question do you have for me this week, Leandra?
Well, in honor of the fact that we are reading sci fi horror, the scariness, the scary factor is kind of important, right? It's part of this genre blend. So, my question for you, Danny, and for those listening, what are you looking for when you want to be scared? And to actually follow that, what are you not looking for? So, it's kind of answer both, and then we can see if we agree.
So I am relatively new to horror. I have dabbled a little bit within the past several years and have gotten a little bit more comfortable, but I'm for sure don't have everything nailed down yet. Because there's a lot. There's a lot of subgenres within horror, sci-fi horror being one of them, and one that I do think that I've enjoyed our little adventures in sci-fi horror so far. I think the biggest thing for me in my enjoyment of horror novels is the eerie atmosphere. I want to feel like someone's creeping over my shoulder, or that a suspicious something or a nefarious something is just waiting for me on the next page. I think that's what keeps me reading in a horror novel. I don't mind gore, as long as it has a purpose and it's not just used to kind of sensationalize pain. I would say I would try to avoid those things. I recently learned that I do not like possession stories. I think they're a little too far, too creepy for me. It really messes with me, and so I do think that I would probably tend to avoid that. But I do like haunted house stories. So like sentient objects, like when the house is alive or like is said to breathe. I love that. So yeah, it's kind of towing the line, I guess, between the things that are too much for me and the things that are just right. What about you? What do you look for?
Well, you stole my answer a little bit, but that's okay. I also am someone who really obsesses over a great atmosphere, that eerie feeling you were saying, because it culminates into setting, also the situation at hand, the conflict, and the characters, their own reactions to what's going on. I want to be in their shoes. So if they feel as though the hairs on the back of their neck or that they're being watched behind that tree, I also want to feel as though I'm being watched, because that is just honestly, it's icing on the cake when you can feel yourself being in their position and feeling that same way, versus if they feel scared and you're just like, you're fine, turn on the lights. It's kind of like, okay. So I think atmosphere can be catching, and that's what's so great about it. It's contagious. And I'm also someone who really loves, I think that goes into the fact where I want a rich setting. So haunted house, you mentioned, I love a haunted house. I love a haunted spaceship or something like that. Just like the foreignness, the otherness of you realizing that you are in a space that is not your own or you don't have control over. The personification you mentioned is great too. Now, for scariness that I'm not as big of a fan of, I think you are right in saying that gore has a purpose. It can actually allow for the tension, right? Especially as far as you and the characters realizing what their own demise could potentially look like, which is icky and terrifying at the same time. But there is that desensitizing moment where it's overdone and it's just gore for gore's sake. And I know there are some, readers out there who are totally fine with it, who really enjoy that type of element. But for me, I think it has to have a purpose. It has to be within reason. And I'm trying to think of what I'm not as big of a fan of in horror specifically. I love that you said possession and that you've discovered that. Whereas for me, I don't I think I'm also quite new to horror as well, to be completely honest. But I think that for me, atmosphere is the best way to say that, like, when a horror is done well, because it also goes across various age categories. For instance, those who are really nervous about horror, I usually recommend middle grade, because if anything, it's usually done really well as far as being atmospheric without being terrifying. So I think that's something that translates well. Whereas again, with gore, there really shouldn't be much gore in a middle grade. Like, what are we
Right.
doing here? Like, why are we traumatizing
100%.
our kids? Like, I don't want my like a child to be like reading about an arm being severed or something like that. Like, that's just not going to happen. So it is interesting to consider, especially as we enter Day of the Triffids, because this one is meant to be scary, and I would argue there are scary moments in there. But what's might be something to consider too is, what's the scare level for this book? Do we find it scary enough? Do we respect the amount of scary that's in here? Do we think that it's well labeled as both sci-fi and horror? Because we have seen that in the past where it seems as though the genre blends we've read may lean over more towards one genre than the other, or we feel as though one of the genres doesn't even exist. So what's the point of calling this a genre blend? So I think that that's something to keep in mind as we get into our discussion of the first 5 chapters. So, speaking of, Danny, I believe that you are taking on the task today of providing us with a little bit of a synopsis of what we've read so far.
I do have the lucky task of summarizing for you guys. So, as we said, we've read the first 5 chapters. We have our main character, Bill. So, the very, very beginning of the book, Bill wakes up in a hospital bed, and it was for a planned eye surgery. He is completely blind at the moment because he has bandages all over his head. And today is the day he's getting his bandages off. But he notices when he wakes up that it's eerily quiet in his hospital room. Usually he can hear the traffic noises, he can hear people walking around the hospital, and now all he hears is quiet outside, maybe some crying in the background, some shuffling, but no one will answer his calls for help because he wants breakfast. That's where we start. He's very hungry, wants his bandages off and to begin his day. And he gets brave and walks out into the hallway and yells for someone for help. And all of a sudden, this really loud noise, people start heading towards him, or he thinks he hears people heading towards him because he can't see. And he ends up shutting the door and closing himself off into his room and kind of remaining quiet there for a little bit and just hoping that someone comes and helps him. No one does. So he takes it upon himself to take his bandages off and to kind of really be brave and figure out whether or not, what's going on in the world. And so he takes his bandages off, goes out into the hospital, realizes that everyone in the hospital is blind, and goes out into the world and discovers that everyone in the city is blind. And in his wanderings, he runs across a girl. Her name is Josella, and or a woman. I'm not sure exactly how old she is. And she is strapped to a man who is beating her. And he helps save her, realizes that she can also see. So, Bill and Josella are two of the individuals who can see in a world of people who have lost their eyesight. And we are following their survival story, essentially. So, at this point, we are going to get into spoilers. So, for those of you who haven't read the first 5 chapters, or if you're not interested in spoilers, it's time to leave us, friends. But for those of you who are wanting to have a discussion, we're here for you.
Thank you so much for that synopsis, Danny. Now we are ready to get into our fully spoiler discussion. And that means we are going to start at the beginning, including Bill Mason waking up in his hospital bed. So, what were your thoughts, especially about that first chapter? Because if we're being honest, the entire first chapter was him ruminating and kind of coming to a realization of what's happening, at least in his small sphere of perspective, and also him growing ever more tense, ever more afraid of what actually is happening outside that world. And even if you wanted to, like, what was your first initial of the tone? Because I would say that the opening first couple paragraphs were weirdly funny to me and kind of mundane and like a really interesting perspective that I wasn't prepared for. I don't know what I expected the tone to be, but there is humor in this book, which we can get into, and whether we like the humor or not. But yeah, what were your first initial reactions, at least to that kind of first opening scene?
It did seem very, like, every day. Like, this is just it was him describing the world, essentially, and it reminded me, which I'm sure that this book probably was partially inspired by this, of Leave the World Behind. And these really mundane things that we notice as humans, or that, like, the white noise in the background of our world. But Leave the World Behind kind of describes some of actually, the whole book is very, very much describing the mundane things that humans go through. And so it surprised me. The tone originally surprised me because I was thinking that we were going to kind of jump into it being really horrifying and him kind of knowing what was going on, but instead we have him subtly realizing that there's something wrong. And I loved the discussion within himself of telling himself not to overreact. Like, I'm not a kid in the basement scared of, walking up the basement stairs. I'm overreacting because I can't see and one of my senses is gone. Like, it will be fine. Someone will come in. He even talks about how us as humans, we constantly feel like uh, bad things can't happen here. Like, bad things happen there. They don't happen in our world or on our street. And so he was trying to kind of convince himself. And then I also loved the discussion that he had about taking his bandages off and how brave it was. Like, the fact that if he kept his bandages on, it allowed him to stay in his world of denial, that, like, he didn't have to know. And if he didn't know what was going on, he didn't have to be freaked out. It was just kind of a Schrodinger's cat situation type thing. And then as he took it off, he was talking about, like, what if I take my bandages off and I realize I really am blind? And I've been blind for a week, and it's been really hard. And this was before he knew anything happened to anyone else. So, yeah, I really liked just the, introspection, I guess, within the first chapter.
Oh, for sure. Oh, there's so much to respond to. So, first and foremost, the mundanity of this opening, scene, this experience, this slow realization. It's almost small baby steps leading into realizing not only that something's wrong, but then being brave enough to figure out what that thing is. And we don't often get this type of beginning when we're dealing with something that's, in essence, the opening of a dystopian novel, because this is sci-fi horror, but it is also the end of the world, basically, as we know it, the end of human civilization in the 1950s when this was written. So it's really interesting because a lot of times when we are reading dystopian lit, it is far after. We don't get to see the desolation, like the slow decay of society, or the war that brings a very quick end to society. So this was kind of an interesting way of having us look at it from his perspective, and I found it really realistic. I
Yeah,
actually could understand, as you said, his brain refusing to acknowledge that the worst could have happened, because why would we think that? We
yeah,
we usually have some type of rational explanation. And his brain, the way he tried to honestly realize it, was saying, well, is it not Wednesday? Maybe it's not Wednesday. Maybe I'm wrong about what day it is. Maybe I'm wrong about what time it is. And he's listening for the clock chimes, and it chimes 8. And he's like, okay, I'm right. It is 8 a.m. I've been on this, monotonous schedule. A nurse should come in. And him, waiting and wondering why his schedule is off. And the reason why he thinks it's Sunday is because of how quiet it is. But then he realizes, wait, it's actually even more quiet than it should be on a Sunday. There should be some traffic. I should hear some people moving about. And instead, you're not even hearing birds. So it's this very unsettling, quiet feeling. And because he's obviously blind at the moment, having his bandages on, his hearing is even more heightened. He's so reliant on it that the fact he doesn't hear anything is actually a bit more terrifying, because that's what he's been relying on. And yeah, I love the parallel that you mentioned, how it's the fear of him unwrapping his bandages, waiting to see if the surgery worked.
right.
So that in itself is a hurdle, because there's the fear of strangeness going around him. But he's like, if I also realize that the surgery didn't work, then I have this own thing to deal with alone. There was a line that mentioned how it was actually more terrifying to unbandage himself alone, rather than like having a companion be there with him to either comfort him or at least be there to support him as he's dealing with this. So I just think it was really well done. Even as I'm so glad you brought up the comparison to him being a child and laying in bed and feeling as though something's in the room with you, and the fear of even turning the light on because
Yes.
that could alert the creature that you've moved or something. I've totally been there as a child. And yeah, I appreciate that it was a slow experience. It may feel like strangely slow because we're expecting kind of a quick narrative, but even him after going outside with his bandages just for a quick second into the hallway, being terrified, putting, like shutting the door and then him just crawling back into bed and kind of hiding for a little bit to calm down. That feels very realistic. It's slow, but it's very realistic. And I really love that hospital scene. And even when he, took off his bandages, and realizing, okay, I can see. I think the first thing he did was put a chair under the doorknob. He, secured himself to like give him a moment to figure out what was happening. I will say that once he leaves the hospital room and begins to make his way throughout the hospital, there were some like pretty disturbing descriptions that, again, I think because of the time, because of how short it is too, it wasn't in huge detail. But the realization of him, well, actually, I'm getting ahead. So first and foremost, he ends up walking into this ward room where it's a bit more public, and he sees the patients waiting around. One of the patients says, "Hey, can you actually finally turn on the lights and open the blinds?" And when he does. The person complains that, "Hey, what's taking so long? Open the blinds." And he turns, and the light is hitting this man's face, and he's just not seeing it. And that it was disturbing and also just heartbreaking,
Yeah.
realizing this. And I do find it fascinating, Bill's choice. He makes quite a few choices in this book that it makes you wonder, would you have the same, thought process? And is he making the right decision in the moment? But rather than revealing to these people in the room that they are blind, he makes up an excuse saying, this is actually harder than I thought. I'm going to need to ask someone. And he removes himself from the room. And I don't know what I would do in that situation, because it's one of those things where, should you be the person to tell these people what's going on, especially when you have no answers?
Yeah.
And could that be putting yourself and everyone else in greater danger because of this emotional reaction that is bound to happen?
Yeah. I would without a doubt be like someone who would end up dying because because I wouldn't catch on. Like I would have opened the blinds and then the guy would have said, "What's taking so long?" And I've been like, "What do you mean the blinds are already open?" Like I would not have like
Yeah.
taken time to even
No
figure
filter.
out what was going on. So I know that I probably would have ended up like being the person that was like swarmed by all these blind people asking for help. Because I just wouldn't have realized what was happening prior to. But it was very interesting to see Bill make those decisions and grapple with them in his head too, because he would make a decision and he would even question like, "I know I could probably help, but," and then he would move on. And he does end up, and I don't know if we want to jump to that part yet, but he does end up making a decision to help someone and it ends up poorly.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So yeah, let's slowly make our way into that scene. So he does, as he makes his way through the hospital, realize that it is an entire, at least an epidemic within, the hospital itself. Not sure what's going on, how far it reaches. But even when he takes the stairs, and he also discovers people who have fallen, who have died that way due to them not realizing what's going on and panicking. And then even he has to take a like staff exit because there is no room to even make way throughout this like main area within the hospital to get outside, because they are just wandering, and they have no idea where they're going. They are like body to body as well. And so he again has to decide, I'm not going to go in that hallway. I'm not going to do it. I can't. I know for a fact that I am not capable of fixing the situation. And also, if I lead them outside, then what? How am I helping them by leading them outside when they still don't know what's going on? There is no assistance. I don't know how, like, I don't know what assistance I can give them. And so he does quietly leave the hospital. And then he also does end up running into a blind person. Like a and it's really hard to explain, but they were blind prior to this mass event. So they have the cane, they're just making their way down the street. And there was this odd kind of humor going on where the guy is complaining that he's run into so many people and he's so frustrated that no one's looking where they're going. And he has to explain to him what has happened. And the man's kind of smug. He's kind of like, okay, well, good luck to you out there, and carries on his way. I think he describes it as this man walking a little bit taller, being a bit more
Yeah.
confident. And I don't know if the author meant this, but what's really interesting about that is this fact that I kind of understand his smugness, because including, modern day 2025, there are so many places, so many public places that are not accessible for those with disabilities, that don't accommodate, they don't consider what it's like. And so this gentleman, I get it. I understand why he's feeling, well, I feel capable. I'm able to go through the world. And is it also a bit kind of like dark to think about him chill with this? Yes, but I found that really interesting that he comes across someone who genuinely is like, this has been my day to day for who knows how long. Maybe he was born that way. Maybe there was some reason that led to his blindness. But yeah, it's interesting that the author knew to include a character like that, even if it was in passing.
Yeah. I found that scene very interesting, and I didn't expect it either because, in a world full of people who've just become blind, you don't think about the people who've been living with blindness their entire lives or, for however long, that have built their skills in navigating a world that was built for people who can see. And so, yeah, it was really interesting. I really enjoyed that scene with him being able to interact with this person and their reaction because it wasn't what I expected either. I guess I expected that character to be a little bit more empathetic towards what was
Mm,
happening, but why? Like, as far as like, maybe that's all they've ever known, and, you know, they had to learn how to live, and so I mean, I do understand, like, where the author went with it. It just wasn't what I was expecting, which I think is really fun to get to some unpredictable things because I do think that there were some things that were very predictable as far as like the atrocities that humans inevitably enact on one another when emergency situations come about, the violence and um, almost dog eat dog type of a world that ends up happening whenever people end up in situations that they don't really know how to survive.
yeah, for sure. And yeah, we see. I'm actually, because this book is so short and we've really not gotten very far into it, although we are a third of the way. It is interesting the different types of scenes we've experienced and the different reactions we've had. We have had that dog eat dog, the initial instinct for violence to show dominance or to like somehow use it to gain some type of sense of control. Some of these humans are doing, whereas there are others where there have been brief moments of suddenly working together. There is a moment where this man ends up working with another woman and her seeing child who is described as like a baby who can kind of communicate, but obviously isn't an adult. And they have the child help them, and he uses it to discover where a grocery store is, and he breaks open the window to grab an orange and gives an orange to the woman and her child. And I guess you're just assuming I kind of we left that scene. We don't see them again, obviously, but I just was thinking, okay, they're going to go off on their own story. I'm assuming these three may be together. I don't know. I could just see that happening.
Do we not though? I thought we got a glimpse of them that there was a mob of blind people asking for the child to describe where they are, and the child was very frustrated because they it didn't know what they wanted.
I assumed that was a separate child. I
Okay.
think it's described as, because there's at one point Bill lists the number of seeing people he's seen,
Okay.
And he mentions a baby and he also mentions a child. So I assumed the baby was the woman's child. And unfortunately, this child may have been alone. So it's also very dark to consider. I was wondering if Bill was going to try to help this child and he doesn't. So there are moments where our character is gray, but I can't fault him because he's also surviving and he's not doing anything blatantly horrific. But there are those moments where I think traditionally in a novel you would expect our hero to help someone, and I assume that, and he does help, but he's also very strategic and trying to consider where he can, and we also see where he fails, which we can get into that. But let's jump to the moment where I think you were going to talk about where he tries to help someone and it does go astray. I'm assuming there are two kind of areas where we could have been talking about this, but I'm assuming you're talking about the bar scene where he ends up entering the bar and helps this gentleman find, I think he was looking for whiskey and he kept opening bottles that were gin. There's another
That's not
scene
the
where
scene I was talking about, but we
well,
can talk about that one too, though.
yeah, let's talk about that one just mainly because the reason why I feel like that's a failed moment of helping, because it then ends in a way that I wasn't expecting, with this man making a certain decision and then going upstairs to join his family, we'll say. So I don't know if you want to speak on that or if I should keep going with it.
You keep going.
Well, for that one, for those of you who need a reminder, because again, there's a lot of small scenes. Like
Yeah.
Bill interacts with a lot of strangers that we just, again, it's a fleeting moment, but he hears this crashing and he's also like, I need a drink. Like he is stressed. He also smokes in the hospital, which I think is very funny to consider how things are used to be so
Oh,
normalized
yeah.
and now it wouldn't be something normal to do. And this was before, he realized that civilization had broken. So this was a normal thing. This wasn't him realizing, oh, I might as well smoke in the hospital, doesn't matter. And then he follows the crashing and discovers that this man is blindly, of course, trying to open and figure out which bottle is which. And he keeps pulling up, I think it's gin. He's like, oh my God,
Mhm.
another gin. And he throws the bottle and is looking again. And so very calmly, Bill helps him, gives him, a bottle. He grabs a drink himself of brandy, and they kind of have a very brief one-on-one discussion about where the world is, what's happened, why it's happened, which we haven't even gotten into that, which we should.
Right.
But the man mentions that his wife is braver than he because she ended up electing to take her own life and the children's upstairs. I believe that they ended up turning on the gas, and so they are all dead upstairs. And he says that he is basically trying to find liquid courage to join them. And it's this quite like very quick sad scene where you realize what this man is about to do, and he does end up going upstairs, and our main character then must carry on with his own journey. And we've seen a few scenes in which people do end up deciding to take their own lives. I think that's also believable, unfortunately, in this type of disaster moment. I'm also surprised, I guess I'm not, but there are so many people who just blindly go out into the world, and I just kept thinking, well, these people know how to even return to their homes.
Right.
I get them, going off to maybe get supplies, food, answers, help. But some of them, I just can't help but thinking, are they aware enough of their surroundings to know how to get back home? And that's kind of also this very sad, scary thing to think about if you were in their shoes.
Yeah. I was a little shocked. I think it's believable to have people committing suicide and people who are wandering out on their own. I was a little shocked with how quickly it happened. And I kept
Mm,
going back and forth in my mind on whether or not I found that believable. I think that there are certain people that definitely would do that, but the enormity of the population that we see just wandering the streets, even the hospital scene, like the front lobby of the hospital with them being packed, back to back with people who were blind and looking for someone for help. I guess I just assumed that if that were to happen, that there would be more people crying for help and staying stationary. But it's kind of, I mean, nothing like that has ever happened. And so it is, up to reader's choice on, whether or not you think that your world would go one way or the other. So I was a little surprised by that. I thought the pacing of the atrocities happened a little too quickly, but then you also have these really slow moments, which you mentioned, of the child and the man breaking into the store and them having this discussion on whether or not it's correct to do. Like, is it right? Even Bill in the beginning walks for a really long time without eating, and, we start his story with him wanting breakfast, and so he does not have any food in his stomach, and he walks past several locations that he could stop and very easily go and steal food because he can see, his surroundings, and he knows that no one is around, but he just thinks it's wrong, and inevitably, he uses the car crash of someone who wrecked into a grocery store or a convenience store, I can't remember, and he goes in and just goes in through the broken window and gets food, and he still leaves money on the counter because he just doesn't feel right about taking that. And so I did find that very believable. I do think that people would have some turmoil within themselves of when is the time that laws no longer matter. And so it was very polarizing. Like the fact that we have these really broad swings from people reacting really horribly to then people still trying to hold on to their humanity, which is a very interesting thing to look at.
Mhm. And I suppose it's also good to note that they are in the center of London, a very heavily
Yeah,
populated
true.
area. So his experiences of like just how many people, I guess it's hard to know, or he just
Yeah,
feels as though this is a more populated street and people are kind of crowding. And so I don't know. It's tough to consider. And like you said, this has never happened. So who knows? But I really loved the amount of contemplation we have from Bill, because this is also written from some future moment where Bill is reflecting upon the past. And I do love that because he even acknowledges it at one moment in the book saying, hey, I'm going to be discussing objects and activities, buildings, things that just don't mean anything now. Like they literally don't mean anything to what in his world would be the modern day reader, but I'm
right.
going to say it because they represent the time. And obviously that provides us perspective because we are, from that time and away. And so I kind of find that really interesting. And even this, notion of I could easily break in and just grab some food. There's no one there. There's no police to stop me from doing this. I clearly need the food. But the thing that's also holding him back is saying, if I do that, that truly means we cannot go back, that
Yeah,
civilization and normalcy as we know it is actually ending the moment I break that window and break in and grab some food or something. So that back to that idea of trying to get your brain on course to know and accept what your reality actually is. And yeah, he just ends up saying, well, no, I'm actually going to just go hungry, or again, wait for an opportunity where it's not really my fault. I haven't broken into this convenience store. And then he does end up, as we said, kind of interact with a few other seeing people. But before we get into that, including that weird train of people, yeah, that were doing the Congo line, we can
that's
talk
the
about
scene
it.
I was gonna talk about.
Yes. I figured, I was like, as soon as I brought up the bar, I was like, it could be the other scene. But there is also the acknowledgement. I think it might have been like most of chapter 2, where we actually understand what supposedly is linking to all of these people's blindness. And that was this comet show where everyone was going outside, almost like for us, the 4th of July, where you put up, your chairs and say, ooh, ah, the light show. Everyone and their mother across the world is, going outside to watch this meteor shower, is really what it is. And the light is so bright, so like, blinding, literally. And people are saying, oh, you don't want to miss this. Meanwhile, our main character, it's kind of this moment of, in any other circumstance, would be kind of humorous because the nurse is saying, ah, if only you could see it. And he's like, yeah, if only, but I am bandaged. So how about you just let me be and stop rubbing it in my face? But there is the suggestion that that is likely the moment that led to everyone's blindness because everyone, the radio, the television, everyone was telling you to go outside, open your windows, experience this. And then as we go and we meet Gisela, we realize why she missed it. And so we are seeing that the reason why there are some people who still have their vision is that one thing or another, chance, fate, whatever it is, led them to not watch this meteor shower the night before.
Yeah, which also makes sense why we have some children that
Mhm.
because, children's bedtimes perhaps they didn't care to watch the meteor show. And then we also had some suggestions that maybe they're not really meteors.
Mm,
Maybe the
mhm.
Triffids have something to do with it, which we can get into whenever we start talking about that, but yeah, I found the meteor show, and, he asks a question when he first addresses it of why did they broadcast it? Why did they make it so widely known and so, like, pushing people to go out and see it? Why was this something that was why was this moment the moment that they decided to push everyone to go out and watch the stars and watch the sky? The descriptions of it were beautiful, and I can imagine that I would have been curious.
Yeah, we would have been blind. It's kinda sad to be like, "Yep, yeah, I would have been one of those people who have been like, "Okay, let's experience this moment," and, gosh, the devastation of it. But anyway, so that ends up being, revealed, and, we also actually, I think, quite early-ish on in the book, we have the reveal of why he had to go under this, surgery for his eyes, and it's very interesting how many layers there are to this idea of blindness because we've got the meteor shower that's, supposedly led to mass blindness. And we also have, as you mentioned, the Triffids, or possibly we should be saying Triffids. We can get into that too, because now I'm struggling with. It feels like I'm struggling with my own identity. I don't know which one to say. I don't know what we should say, but I guess we'll carry on with Triffids for now. So the Triffids we discover are this plant that we don't know necessarily the origin. There's no proof, but we know that at the moment, everyone directs it as being originated from Russia. And uh, basically, there's this really kind of like random story of a pilot, telling this oil company, fish oil company, hey, I've got something better for you. And it is Triffid seed oil, and it's like a very top secret thing where no one really outside of Russia and certain Asian areas know of it. And when he is going to be smuggling all of these seeds out, well, Russia may have shot down his plane, all of the cargo is dispersed, and all of these seeds are carried across the wind, and places including England, including Bill's own backyard, where he was living with his parents at the time. So that also suggests it was years and years ago too, that they have been around in the community. These plants are just growing, like an unknown weed in a garden, which also reminds me of the intro that Jeff Vandermeer had been discussing of his own wilding of his garden and these, invasive species, which I love. I love that we're talking about an invasive species through this very odd plant. And we learn so much about these plants. Like we learn quite a bit about them. How about what did you learn, Danny?
First off, the discovery of the fact that they can move, but then also the progression of humans farming them and
Mm,
then capturing them almost like there were descriptions of them being chained because they didn't want them to move, um, because they wanted to harvest their oil and make money off of them. They also discovered that they have a stinger that they, can, eject venom from. They have these little venom sacs, which is inevitably what causes our main character Bill's eyesight problems because he ends up getting struck with one of the stingers. He was wearing a mask, but some of the venom ended up seeping in through the mask into his eyes or like flying into his eyes. And so that's why he ended up having eye surgery because he was going to go blind because of that. But because we know they have these stingers and they end up killing several people, they started docking their stingers. But then there was research done that the oil was better if they had their stingers. And you have like all of this discussion that essentially is just surrounding how can we use these beings for our betterment and for our money, which I just think is very interesting social commentary.
mhm. And to also go back to the way they walked, the fact
Yes.
that they have like, these almost like three legs in a way where two move forward and then the third kind of like drags itself to follow. And all I could think of, the original zombie. was like, this is how zombies walk. Like, them kind of like the slow meander.
Yes.
And it kind of looks like, like almost, it was described as if the plant was on crutches, this kind
Yeah.
of like this weird, meandering walk. And I was like, this is a zombie. This is a plant zombie. And the fact that they're carnivorous too, right? So
Yeah.
they not only eat insects and other things, but they will gladly take flesh and just like hang out with their victim. And there was also a description where they grow faster and bigger closer to the equator, like in like tropical locations, warmer locations. That's terrifying. And how in certain like tropical jungle areas, it's just there's no way to really curb them. And so you just have to accept that they may be in some type of brush and you could be attacked. Versus, of course, in other climates, they tapered them and tried to basically domesticate them in some way. There's also a mention that they're at the zoo, and obviously in this new destroyed civilization, Bill notices like a group of them, and he's like, those escaped the zoo, those escaped from the
Yep.
zoo. Okay, good to know. That's something that we're going to have to worry about. And the reason why Bill is so knowledgeable is not only did he become obsessed and intrigued by the one in his backyard, and a juvenile Triffid had hit him, and that kind of started him on not being immune, but having a higher tolerance as well for the venom. But because of his obsession, he ends up going into business to learn more, interact with them. And that's where we learn about Walter. And I
Yes.
will say it was a bit sad though, because when he reflects on him, he thinks, I think we all know what probably happened, because I have to just assume that Walter is either blind or whatever the case is. But I really loved what his discussions were with Walter, because it was Walter who got him thinking. And I love that, because our main character, that means he's not this like all-knowing, like, hero of heroes. He isn't smart. Like he's
Right.
common sense. He's a survivor. But and I think we get that when he is comparing himself to his father, because he disappoints his father and not being very good at sums. So I love that we're getting information through other characters, and it makes more sense.
Yeah. I really liked Walter's character. I liked the almost ominousness that he introduces, because he talks about the fact that, like, one of the conversations they were having, he has many with Bill about the Triffids and what he learns about the Triffids, but the one that stood out to me the most was this conversation that he has that, the Triffids, if we didn't have our eyesight, if we as humans didn't have our eyesight, we would be no match for the Triffids. And Bill, I think at some point in time says something about how they must have been listening, and I'm like,
Mm.
"Ooh." Like, how many more things did you say in front of them? Like, so that's what makes me that was the moment where I was like, "Okay, the meteors, whatever they were, maybe they were infiltrated." Also, like, them speaking to one another, I think it might have been at the zoo. They were having, like, this, or maybe it was at their workplace, I can't remember,
I think
but it
it
was
was
like
at their
this.
workplace, because
Okay.
yeah, when Walter and him, it was one night, and Walter says they're very talkative tonight, and you think it's
Yes.
just like this turn of phrase, and he's like, no, he literally says that they're talking.
And you're like, "What?" Yeah, it was kinda creepy. I will say, as far as the Triffids go, I was surprised that they were not the cause, like, I was sup not the cause, but I was surprised that they were not introduced at the time of the blindness. I was thinking
Mm.
things were gonna go hand in hand, and so learning that they've been around for years, decades at this point, we have known about the Triffids, and then all of a sudden this catastrophic event happens. I was a little shocked by that. I did not expect that from the book.
Oh, yeah, no, I was surprised too. Like you, I assumed that these two events went hand in hand. I thought the supposed like meteor shower was them arriving on planet. Like I totally thought that these were alien beings, not that they were some odd evolved creature plant, which they totally can still be alien, because like we've said, we don't know what their true origin is. We just know that to the main world they were being studied and hidden in Russia. So, who knows where they came from prior to that, or what created them. But yeah, it was interesting how it was almost normalized. And I think it also speaks to the fact that, like in essence, this is an invasive species. It's invasive. Nothing else eats it. The only kind of true predator, I suppose, that it has is humans, simply because we have the capability to study them, kill them, that type of thing. But we're also at risk of being harmed by them. So they don't really have a true predator. We're only a predator because we have the technology and the ability to reason. And there's also this interesting discussion of how, yes, we're more advanced than them, but because of that, we also are more vulnerable because we need more things. And to strike us down, simply it is to blind us. Whereas Triffids don't need sight. They're actually fine. So in comparison, we're actually the weaker link. And there was also the mention how the stinger goes for the head, goes for the hands, goes
Yeah.
for the eyes specifically. And that is terrifying. That is very, very scary. But the communicating with their three, I think they've got like three kind of wooden or like poles, like at the bottom, at the base of their stem, their stalk. I don't know how you describe it. And they click. And so then when there's this entire field being researched and, of course, being used to create the seed oil, I'm just thinking that is a huge beacon. So the question is could they have been communicating elsewhere and maybe it took years to get the message and have who knows? I don't know if it's going to be a situation where they are linked to the meteor shower, or it is the case of invasive species are dangerous no matter what, but especially when we, as the humans that have caused this, because it is our fault. Like in this book, it is humans' fault that this species is all across the world. If we aren't there to basically like cut them back, then they will just flourish because there is nothing else that has the reason to recognize. But also, it's our fault that they're there. So it's just, oh my gosh, I love the commentary too.
I do think I wanna mention the train, the weird conga
Oh
line
yes,
scene
let's
real
do it.
quick, and then we do need to get to Gisela.
We do.
So, the only thing I will mention, so there's this weird conga line of people who are following a man who can see, and this man is very clearly taking advantage of the situation, the fact that he has some sort of authority over these people because he has the benefit of being able to see, and this is the moment when Bill decides to stand up and try and help because, there are a couple of men in the line who are like, "I want a woman." And the sightseeing man just goes and snatches essentially women off the street and hands them to these men, and Bill tries to help and ends up getting the crap beat out of himself.
Yeah, I think he gets knocked out. Like he gets like hit in the head enough where he says that he basically comes to, and they're like, the line is far ahead of him, and he just kind of recognizes like, well, and I think he tries to reason with himself that there's a situation where, if anything, they are with a seeing person, so they will get food. And it's one of those really tough things to recognize that, yeah, and there are seeing people who can take advantage of the situation too and
Yeah.
take leadership roles. But then there are also, it's interesting that he has this scene, and then not long after, he also ends up meeting Gisela, as you mentioned. There are sounds of screaming, of crying, of whimpering, and he follows them and finds her tied. Her arms are tied behind her back, and the string leads to another man's wrist. That man is blind, and he's controlling her. We also learn that what led her to leave her own home was in search of a doctor to help her father because her father is blind. And so she gets in the car and tries to make her way. And in her panic, her car ends up not having gas. And so it just stops wherever it is. And that is when she's, in essence, abducted. This blind man asks her for assistance, saying, "Hey, I don't know where I am. Can you help me? Can you lead me to this one street corner?" And then he grabs her, and he's angered that she can see, and he decides to take advantage of her sight, and in essence like decides to like basically treat her as a guide dog, to put plainly. And he also beats her when she says that she refuses to allow him to take her to his home, because who knows what would have happened. Obviously we can have certain assumptions that would be terrifying, and we're very fortunate that Bill came to assist her. And then she asks him, and he's very happy to stay with her, to be her companion as she makes her way home to check on her father. And that's when actually the fear of blindness kind of cross paths, the fear of Triffids, because and then the reason why I'm struggling with calling them Triffids is because three, we know they walk on three legs, like a tripedal, we're bipedal. So it's really messing with me, and we probably should be saying Triffids, but whatever. We'll just continue with Triffids. Next episode, we can decide if we want to call them something else. But we discover that some of the staff members of her home, because she comes from quite a privileged background. Her family has, servants, and she discovers that a few of them have been slain by Triffids that are hiding within her yard. And that's where we're realizing that these blind people are very, very vulnerable to the Triffids that are going about and happily taking them for their next meal.
Yeah, because not only do we have to deal with this new world of people not being able to see and things collapsing essentially that they know, like, electricity isn't going to work anymore, the water towers are going to run dry eventually, and there's all these different things that they're going to have to deal with. Now we also have carnivorous plants that are 7 feet tall wandering the streets. So, yeah, and the fact that she has to witness these people that she's lived with for her entire life. The elderly man who was out in their I think he was their gardener, was out in the road, and he was dead, just laying there when they find the Triffids, and then we have her go inside, and inevitably they find her father, who has also fallen victim to a Triffid. And her reaction, like, I would've frozen. Like, I would I'd fight or flight, I freeze. Like, there's no fight or flight for me. I think I would have just frozen and not been able to cope in that moment. And he does help kind of pull her out and pull her back into the vehicle, and then they think about, like, okay, where do we need to go? And he makes this plan where they're gonna go and get these weapons that they can kill Triffids with to protect themselves, but also they need to find refuge. And so they end up finding an apartment complex that is abandoned. They go and they knock on a whole bunch of doors. And if anybody answers, they moved on to the next door, knocked again until they found one that was empty. However, it wasn't actually empty. This was another scene that we see them, or we see Bill witnessing this young couple. Essentially, the man makes the decision that they're going to die together, which is just heartbreaking, and it was so simplistic, and him trying to coax. Essentially, he convinces his wife or girlfriend, I'm not exactly sure, to come closer to the window, even though he's telling her that they're going towards the door and that they're gonna go outside of the apartment, and he's trying to keep her from the reality that he's going to kill them both. And so that also introduces some interesting things, and whether or not, it was okay for him to do that, to take her choice away from her to try and protect her. Like, there are a bunch of different ways that you can see that. But we have them living in this apartment, which I love that scene as well. Them saying goodbye to the old world. That was one of my favorite parts about this section of the book, was him looking out the window and seeing the skyline, and all these things that he knows are not going to exist in the future. And then Josella dressing up in this lavish gown, taking a glamorous bath, and you know doing all these things one last time because they know it's kind of the end for them.
Oh, yeah, honestly, I think what the one of the most poignant and, like, really kind of beautiful in a sad way was when they arrived at this apartment, because there were so many little scenes. And I'm glad that you brought up the couple, because I think what is so, like, powerful about it is that they never knew that he was there, that he witnessed this moment, and now Bill has to live with that too, and him just having to remain silent, and them just making this decision. And like, like, it made me feel as though I also needed to be quiet. I also couldn't disturb this moment and disturb them. And it's just that it's really kind of strange to think about that he's going to have to witness so many things. So even as he is fortunate to have his eyesight, he's also very unlucky to have to see so much, and no one else realizes that he's witnessing these things that they're experiencing. And yeah, those that moment in the apartment where this last night in London, him saying goodbye to the city, her saying goodbye to comfort. And when he realizes that that's what she's doing, her relief, I think she says, I knew you would understand, or I hoped you'd understand. And them just allowing themselves this last moment, this last hurrah in a very gorgeous apartment, too, which is in itself quite eerie because where are the people that, owned it? And even that, the chapter ends, the section ends with them having a tough time falling asleep because of everything they're hearing outside. And there is this eerie light, like a strobe
Yeah.
light searching. And he marks the window, which I think is so clever to remember where it was coming from in the day so they can maybe potentially find another person who is seeing and see what they were looking for. But in the end, they have to comfort each other, and Gisela comes to him at night and just says, I can't sleep, this is really tough. And she falls asleep on his shoulder, and he eventually falls asleep as well, knowing that, okay, tomorrow's another day, and then hopefully they can leave the city by the following morning, because they really need to leave.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of wraps up too. It goes back to your original comment about him with his bandages and just wanting companionship.
Mm.
And we have this scene that wraps that back up with them having companionship and just being grateful that they have each other because dealing with this alone would be miserable. There's a moment in that apartment, I think it might have been when they were trying to go to sleep, where they can hear someone wailing outside. And Bill has a moment of thought where he's just like the worst part about this is the loneliness, like being alone inside your head with no one to deal with the changes that are happening in your life. It's just heartbreaking to and especially it's heartbreaking because they know they just have to sit and witness it because it would put themselves in danger to go out and help. And he mentions it a couple of times, like with the couple that were in the apartment. He talks about, like, I could have saved them and, maybe brought them food for what, a couple of weeks, and then what then? And so there's just this hopelessness of the decisions that he's making and the regrets that he has, but knowing that it's the only way to survive.
Yeah, I mean, what a first section. I mean, I think it's important for us to close because even though there's so much to talk about, we need to get back to this book. We need to read the second, third, so we can pick up the discussion further and see what happens to these characters before we end up signing off and letting everyone else listening to get back to their books as well. Let's answer the three questions that we usually do at the end of every episode, which is, who is your favorite character at the moment, or at least for this section? Or if anything, like it could be a side character too, because we did meet quite a few side characters. What is your current rating at the moment? What's your projected rating? And then what's one question that you have going into the second section?
I would think that my rating currently is a 4.5. That's where I'm at right now. I am really enjoying it. There are a couple of things that I'm just a little, I don't know about as far as like pacing goes, believability, but my brain keeps going back and forth. And so I really am, I'm enjoying myself. I find it quite thought-provoking, which is very fun for a book that I as classic I am not a classic reader, and so to read something that a lot of other sci-fi works, stand on the shoulders of is very, very lovely to see, so I am excited. My favorite character, I'm gonna have to go with Bill, and I just think it's because 'cause we've spent so much time in his head. I like a lot of the side characters as well that we've met along the way, but I really have enjoyed the fact that he is truly a gray character and him battling with himself about it. Like, he does not feel good about a lot of the decisions that he's made, and so I really love a character that is thought-provoking in that way. And then a question that I have, I really wanna know if the Triffids had, 100% something to do with the meteor shower or if it was just a coincidence that they took advantage of in the end. Because right now it's feeling like they knew about it, but maybe not. What about you?
Well, oh my gosh, I agree with so much that you've already said. So with the star rating, I agree. I feel as though a 4.5 feels solid because for me, I'm also a huge fan of like shorter books. So I don't, necessarily need too many things to be explained. I kind of get that in 1950, some of the believability, some of the,
Yeah.
things are going on. I feel as though respecting that when it was made, maybe people aren't asking the same type of questions as we are today. But for me, it's also some elements have just not aged well. I may have wanted some of the issues to be addressed a little bit less casually. For instance, acknowledging that this is written by a man, and so some of the hard hitting moments experienced by women in this book are addressed, but I just kind of want them to be. I think I would have obviously preferred them to be addressed further, expanded upon, especially the unfortunate elements of women basically being treated as objects, being taken advantage of, being abducted multiple times already in this first section. And so I think a 4.5 sounds good though, because I'm like, I'm very impressed. I'm not gonna lie. I was so nervous going into this book because I had really high hopes while also acknowledging, 1950s might not be, might not age well, but I'm quite impressed. I'm really loving Bill as a main character. So I agree. He's my favorite character so far, although I really appreciated Walter. And I'm glad that Bill isn't alone in this world. I'm glad he has Gisela. I think that they complement each other quite well. But I love being in his head, the way that Bill's describing things, and he's a really interesting character to be following, because the book would have been set up completely differently if we started the book from Gisela's perspective, for instance. Her realization of what's going on versus him in this hospital. I feel like it was a good slow opening, and I'm glad that we were with him in those moments. And then, as far as my question, I have the same question as you, but I'll add that my question. I guess I'll add a second question, and that is, I'm wondering how big our gang of characters will be. Will we
Yeah.
gain any additional companions within the second section, if anything? Because there is that strobe light. Is that going to be a friend, a foe? Are we only going to be following Bill with Gisela for the second section, or will they gain a friend or two as they, flee London? That's what I'm wondering.
Well, we shall see. We have to continue reading to find out.
I can't wait.
So, yes, me neither. So, friends, just so you are aware, for the next episode, we are going to be reading from the chapter Rendezvous to the chapter And Farther On. So, we're going to stop at And Farther On. We're not going to read that chapter. That will be the title that you will see when you stop reading. And so, that will be what we discuss next Friday. We can't wait. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Not Reading for Content. Be sure to check the description for a schedule of our upcoming reads for this season. For reminders and other updates, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Not Reading for Content. Where else can the listeners find you, Leandra?
I have a booktube and an Instagram. My booktube is at Leandra the TBR0, and my Instagram is at Leandra_ the TBR0. How about you, Danny?
I have the same platforms. Both can be found at Danny.dabbles. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to tune in next Friday for our next episode.